All right, we're going to be in the book of Daniel tonight. So if you want to get out your Bibles and be turning there, we'll be trying to work our way through this entire book, and then we'll kind of back out and look at it from the big picture perspective. If you've not studied the book of Daniel before, I'm sorry. This is a great book, and it's sad to me that you have not studied this book. This is an amazing book in the Bible, one of my favorite books. As we study it together, we're going to see how applicable this book is to each and every one of us today. And I would say it's one of the most applicable books that we find in the Old Testament. It's a book about the prophet Daniel, who is brought up originally in Jerusalem and then taken off into Babylonian captivity, away from his family, away from his friends, away from everything he's ever known. And he's brought up in Babylon at a young age, and he lives his life as an exile, as a foreigner, in a foreign land with just a few friends around him who are faithful. And so hopefully we can find plenty of application to ourselves as we study this book. As you look at the book, if you were to try to get a big picture view of this book from an outside perspective, what you'll see is the first 6 chapters are narrative. As you're reading through, you'll be like, wow, this is a great book, and this is really easy to understand. Everything that's in this book, wow, I can't believe how easy this is. And as children, we know the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, because those stories are being told to us over and over again in our Bible classes, because they're so interesting and so encouraging. Then you get to chapter 7, and everything starts to fall apart. Chapter 7 through 12, the second half of the book, is apocalyptic language, which means that there are signs and symbols that are being used to represent some prophecy, some message from God. And trying to discern and understand that can be kind of difficult for us. But hopefully I'll show you as we work our way into that section that it's not nearly as hard as it seems. This is not an extremely difficult book for us to understand, especially today. Maybe just a few sections are really hard, but for the most part, it's really not that bad. All those signs and symbols, almost all of them, we understand what they're referring to, and it's agreed upon what that means. So I'll tell you some of that, but I don't have enough time to tell you all of it, so we'll get through what we can. As you look at the book as a whole, what the impression is, as you go through this book, is that God is in control of everything. God is not just on the sidelines watching everything unfold in history. God is active and working in everything that takes place. From the very beginning, we get this kind of a picture. Read with me in chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." And listen to this. "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of food and that the king ate, and of wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them new names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego." So notice, as you begin this, it just sets up the whole book and lets you know what's going on. Jehoiakim was king, but God gave the king of Jerusalem, the king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. God is in control. God has decided to bring this judgment about. And in the midst of this judgment against Judah, he has allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take some of the Jews, some of the Hebrew young men, and bring them to Babylon, And these men were set up. I mean, they're able to sit and eat a portion of the king's food. Except as we continue in chapter 1, we learn a little bit more about the king's food, and we understand that it's unclean food that Hebrew people were not supposed to eat. So these young Hebrew men are in this foreign land where they're not used to everything, and they're trying to understand everything that's going on, and they're being fed the finest delicacies in all the world, but they have to be the people who say, yeah, I can't eat that. And as we go through chapter 1, what you see is Daniel being faithful to God and the commands of God not to eat the unclean foods and saying, I can't, will you just bring me vegetables? And that chief eunuch that was mentioned there, he tries to save Daniel and himself and says, no, you need to eat these foods because if you don't, then you're going to be weaker. And Daniel says, well, test us and feed us the vegetables, and if we're not stronger and fatter than all these other men, then you can do with us whatever you want. And at the end of the time, they come in to test Daniel and his friends who've just eaten vegetables instead of all the delicacies of the king, and he's stronger. And he's fatter. They're stronger. They're fatter than everybody else. And it turns out they become 10 times better, it says at the end there, than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And Daniel was there in the kingdom of Babylon until the first year of King Cyrus. So the first chapter just kind of sets everything up with a few young men who were Jews from Jerusalem who've been pulled out of their society, which we know is evil from our studies in Jeremiah, and they've been brought into Babylon, put in a difficult situation. They've remained faithful, and God has been faithful to them. God has been protecting them. He makes them fatter and stronger, and He makes them wiser and 10 times better than everybody else. And so from the very beginning, it sets the stage that God is in control of everything. And all of this first chapter is in Hebrew, which would be the language of the Jews. In chapter 2, verse 4 and following, it actually changes over into Aramaic instead of just staying in Hebrew. And it stays in Aramaic all the way through chapter 6, which is a language that's more widely acceptable. And you go, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it's just interesting. If you were reading this originally, you'd be like, wait, there's a different language in chapter 2. And the reason is because it would be more broadly known. That's a more broadly known language. And so as we go into the rest of the sections of chapters 2 through 6, what we're seeing is a message that would be intended to go out to all the nations. Well, what is this message? What is he trying to tell us in all this narrative? Well, it brings up a number of kings and different actions that kings do. First of all, we have the king's food in chapter 1, but then in chapter 2, we have the king's dream. King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it scares him. And you think, wait, he's a king. How is he ever scared? Well, he's worried about this dream. He goes to his chief musicians and his wise men and says, tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they say, well, you tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation. Nobody can tell you the dream. I mean, you had the dream. You're the only one that saw it. Only the gods can know that. And Nebuchadnezzar says, I know you've been lying to me, so I'm going to kill you all unless you tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they can't tell him the dream. So then a soldier of Nebuchadnezzar's goes out to start killing all the wise men. They come to Daniel, and Daniel says, tell the king to wait and give me time to come to him, and I'll tell him the dream and its interpretation. And then Daniel goes to his friends, to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and he talks to them and says, pray to God. And God reveals to Daniel the dream, and he reveals to him the interpretation. So he goes before the king, and he tells him this dream. And this is an important dream to begin the book, because this is kind of setting up where all this book is going to be going throughout. He tells of this dream, and it's a dream of a statue. And the statue has a head that's of gold, a chest of silver, a waist and a thigh of bronze, and then lower legs of iron and feet with iron mixed with clay. And then all of a sudden a rock comes out that was not cut by human hand, and it strikes the feet, and it shatters the whole statue, and eventually becomes a great mountain. And it says, in verse 35 at the end, the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Very interesting. And then Daniel gives the interpretation. He says, these four parts are four kingdoms. The first is you, and then after you will come the Medo-Persian Empire, and then after them the Greeks, and then after them the Romans. We know this from history. And then God, it says, in the days of the fourth king, will establish his kingdom. Verse 44. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. So this is kind of the initial dream that we're going to see repeated throughout the book of Daniel. This idea that God is in control of the kingdoms of men, and God knows the future. He knows what's going to happen in all these kingdoms, and he is planning something really big in the fourth kingdom. So God just lets that be known from the very beginning. As Daniel comes before the king, he reveals all this to him. He is then promoted, and he has Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all promoted in the kingdom, and they're going to live a greater life because God has been working. God is in control. And then in chapter 3, we see Nebuchadnezzar make his own image of gold. Well, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Well, he thinks, I'm the gold in the statue. I'm going to make this image of gold, and everybody's going to need to bow down to it as soon as we play this music. And so he has the music played, and everybody bows down except for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's the same people. They don't bow down, and so people tell on them because they're jealous of them, and they get brought before the king. And the king says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what are you doing? Come on, bow down before this statue. I'll play some music for you, and you can bow down, and then everything will be fine. And they say, we're not going to bow down to any statue. We won't worship anything but the Lord our God. And Nebuchadnezzar said, I've got to throw you in the furnace. That was the consequence for not bowing down. And so he commands the furnace to be heated up, and he has his mighty men bind these men and take them and throw them into the furnace, and it's so hot it kills the mighty men. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall into the furnace, and maybe Nebuchadnezzar goes about thinking, okay, well, that's just too bad. I mean, these guys were pretty good in the kingdom. And then he looks inside and he sees not 3 men, but 4 men walking around unbound in the midst of the fire. And so he calls for these men to come out. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out of there. And he talks to them, and he commends them because they were unwilling to bow down and worship this idol. They sacrificed themselves to this God. And this is what he says in verse 28 of chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Now, isn't that amazing that you hear from the king, this pagan king, glory to God, because he has done what Nebuchadnezzar's never seen anyone ever do. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're not going to worship and serve. We don't know if God's going to save us or not. And he sees God did it. And this was by the work of God. They come out of the fire. They don't smell like smoke. Their hair's not singed. They seem completely unaffected by any of it. And Nebuchadnezzar is just blown away. Well, chapter 4 is one of the most fascinating chapters in the book. As you start off, notice who's writing this chapter. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. Now listen to who's speaking here. Nebuchadnezzar is writing this. We have words in our Bible that were written by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar himself. And this is what he says. He says, I had a dream that made me afraid in verse 5. And so he eventually goes to Daniel and he tells Daniel the dream this time. And he says, here's my dream. There's a tree in the midst of the earth, and it's this huge, beautiful tree, and all the birds of the heaven are in it, and the beasts are under it, and it's just beautiful, and it's fruitful, and it's abundant. And then everything seems to be going well for that tree, but all of a sudden there's this watcher, this holy one, in other words, an angel, who makes this decree: chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump and its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him, notice the transition from a tree to a person, let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the wild beasts of the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. These are the words from the watchers, and this is the vision that he sees. And Daniel doesn't want to tell King Nebuchadnezzar what this means, because it's not good. And so he starts out with, "Oh, King, live forever. Let this be for your enemies." And he says, essentially, this is you and your kingdom, unless you repent and humble yourself before God. Because God he's saying in this dream, he's going to cut you down and reveal to you how great and wonderful he really is, how powerful he really is. And so it seems as though Nebuchadnezzar actually repents for a time. And then at the end of 12 months, after about a year, he's up on his ledge and he's looking over his kingdom and he says, "Oh, wow, man, is this not great, the great city that I have built by my power and the royal residence for the glory of my majesty?" And guess what? His mind leaves him. And next thing he knows, he's out in the middle of a field eating grass next to the cows. Kingdom stripped from him, until his hair grows long and his nails grow long. Some long period of time passes by with him just out in the field eating grass in the dew, and this crazy madman. And he does it for some period of time, and then finally his senses return to him and he realizes that God is the ruler of the earth. He is the Most High. He is the one who is in control. Look at verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" See how Nebuchadnezzar comes to this realization: God is in complete control of everything. And God returns to Nebuchadnezzar his kingdom, and everything that he had before is added back to him. In verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heavens, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. This is all about the king's humbling. God humbles this king who is proud and mighty and helps him to see how small he really is. And then we leave Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 5, we move on. Daniel outlasts Nebuchadnezzar, and we move to his grandson, Belshazzar. Okay, Belshazzar in chapter 5. And Belshazzar is throwing this great feast for 1,000. And it turns out, as we'll find out in just a minute, the Persians, the Medo-Persian army is outside the walls, and he's inside having this great feast, and they decide, hey, let's get all the vessels from the temple of Jerusalem, and let's start drinking from those, and we'll worship the gods of the gold and silver and all of this. And all of a sudden, Belshazzar sees a hand writing on the wall, and there's no body attached to it. And he goes over and it says it twice. His color changes. He goes from being all happy and proud and boastful to being terrified. And he asks all the wise men and all the magicians to come and interpret what the handwriting on the wall means. And eventually the queen mother tells him, Daniel is like no other. You should ask him. And Daniel comes in, and the first thing Daniel does is say, you knew what God did to your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And yet you decided to boastfully, arrogantly take all the vessels from the temple and have this party. And so now this is God's judgment against you. This is what the words say. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin, verse 25. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And after this, Belshazzar crowns Daniel, makes him third in rank in all the kingdom, and gives him all this glory and honor. But it says in verse 30, that very night the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Belshazzar only has one chapter here, and all it's about is just saying God can destroy a king in a night if he wants to. God can just wipe him out, the arrogant and the proud. God can wipe out in a single night if he desires. In chapter 6, we transition to another king. This is Darius the Mede. Darius is coming in from this new empire, and you've heard of probably Cyrus the Persian. Well, the Medo-Persian Empire was a joining of those two different nations. And Darius seems to be the Mede side that is over the province of Babylon. And so Daniel's still in Babylon, and he becomes one of the high officials in the province of Babylon. And as you read through this, what you see is Darius really likes Daniel, and Daniel seems to be doing great. Everything's going well for him. And everybody else starts to get jealous of Daniel, and they decide that they're going to trick Darius into making a law that will result in the death of Daniel. And so this chapter reveals to us the king's law, that the king decides, I'm going to make this law. If you pray to any other gods except for King Darius, you'll be thrown into the lion's den. For 30 days, don't pray to any other gods except for the king. Notice what Daniel does in verse 10. When Daniel knew the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He's commanded. There's a law in the land. Don't worship God. Don't pray to God. And yet Daniel cares more about his relationship to God than he cares about the law of the land. He decides he will do what his God desires him to do. He will seek after the Lord rather than seeking after being pleasing to the kings of earth. Well, those enemies find out about it, and they bring him before Darius, and Darius doesn't even want to, but he has to throw him into the lion's den, and he does it, and then he goes and fasts, and he prays, and he wants Daniel to be delivered, and it turns out Daniel was delivered. He was completely unharmed, and all those enemies who were against him get thrown in, and those lions devour them before they even touch the floor and break all their bones. So God delivers Daniel. And after this, Darius makes this decree in verse 26, that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues and works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. You see in this, God delivering once again his faithful. And God showing that he is the most powerful in all the earth. Well, that's the end of the narrative section of the book. And so as we transition into the apocalyptic section, I want us to remember how easy all of that was to understand. And I hope that you remember that dream that Nebuchadnezzar has of the four kingdoms, because that's going to come up again and again. In the very next chapter, in chapter 7, what we see is a vision of Daniel. You remember how Nebuchadnezzar had all these visions. Now we start to see visions of Daniel. Really, this is all just telling us about visions God gives to Daniel. And this vision is of this great sea. And out of the sea comes a beast. And this is a great beast that's like a lion with eagle's wings. And its wings are plucked off, and it's allowed to stand up like a man. And then after the lion, there's a second beast that comes up, and it's like a bear. And it's raised up on one side, and it has 3 ribs in its mouth. And then after the bear, there's a third beast that comes, and it's a leopard that has 4 wings on its back and 4 heads, and dominion is given to it. And then finally, there's this fourth beast. Remember, there's 4 parts of the statue. Well, now there's 4 beasts. And the fourth beast doesn't have an animal form. It's just a dreadful beast. And the way it's described is that it has iron teeth, and it just tramples everything that it walks around. And it has horns on it, 10 horns. And one horn, a little horn, pops up, and it uproots 3 horns. But it speaks great things, and you kind of wonder, what are those great things? Well, as he looks in verse 9, thrones are placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Now, the Ancient of Days is a reference to God. He is the Ancient of Days. He's the God who's always existed. And he takes his throne, and he casts judgment against the fourth beast, who's speaking all these great things. And the beast is killed, and his body is destroyed. And then in verse 13, it transitions again. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So as we look at this, we see 4 beasts, and then we see a son of man coming and being given a kingdom. Well, what are these 4 beasts? Look at verse 17. The 4 beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. So there are 4 kings, and then they're going to be replaced by this new kingdom. And that just overall sounds a lot like the first vision that we were given. In fact, don't be thrown off by it saying 4 kings. Verse 23 talks about the 4th king as being a kingdom, and so really it's just 4 kingdoms. It's all the same kind of thing. And the great words that are spoken are words spoken against God in pride and in arrogance. In verse 25 it talks about that. And God is going to judge that kingdom because of its pride and its arrogance, just like he did Babylon. And the greatness of that kingdom will be destroyed. And it says in verse 27, it will be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So it's really, it's symbols, and it's kind of like, whoa, what's going on? But it's really not that hard, right? It's the same as the previous visions, the same kind of thing going on. There's 4 kingdoms. During the 4th kingdom, a new kingdom will be set up that will be an everlasting kingdom. You get that picture in your mind. Well, now it kind of gets a little bit more confusing, because he doesn't bring up all 4 kingdoms. Instead, he starts bringing up the 2nd and 3rd kingdom in chapter 8. This is a vision of the ram and the goat. Okay? There's this ram with 2 horns, and it goes and it conquers everywhere. And then there's a goat with 1 horn between its eyes, and it comes out and slaughters the ram, and then the horn is broken off, and 4 horns come up in its place. Well, what in the world is that about? Well, it's the 2nd and 3rd kingdom. In fact, we don't have to guess that. He actually tells us that's exactly what this is. In verse 20, as for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Who was the first king of Greece? Alexander the Great, who was cut off. And then four horns arose. So we don't even have to guess here, and that's what this is about. But why is he telling us all of this about the second and third kingdom? The reason is, during the third kingdom, after those 4 horns come up, one little horn will come up, and that little horn is going to cause a lot of trouble for God's people. And so Daniel is given a little bit of foresight about the trouble that is going to come to God's people during the time of the Greek Empire. And that trouble is, of course, from a man by the name of Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He will come in and rage against God's people and deceive them and prosper. And then it says, without warning, he shall destroy many in verse 25. And he'll even rise up against the prince of princes, that is the high priest at that time, and he'll be broken, but not by a human hand. And so after Daniel hears this, that during the Greek Empire, there's going to be this huge devastation against God's people, it says in verse 27, he becomes sick and really worried about all this. And for many days, he's appalled because he doesn't understand what is this, and why is this happening? Well, chapter 9, we transition, move a little bit forward in time to the time of Darius. Those were under the reign of Belshazzar. Now we move ahead to the time of Darius. And here we find Daniel praying because it's been 70 years, and now the Medo-Persians have taken over, and now Daniel prays for God to do what he said he would do under Jeremiah, to set the people free. And so God sends an angel to Daniel, and the angel doesn't tell him, yeah, your people are going to go free. He gives him another vision. And it talks about the people going back in some ways, but instead he's trying to reveal to Daniel something much bigger. You've seen the 70 years. Well, now there's going to be 70 weeks. And he says for the first 7 weeks it's going to be like this, and then for 62 weeks it's going to be like this, and then for a week it's going to be like that. And this vision is not so easy. Remember I said there's some parts that are really hard and complicated. Well, this vision seems to be discussing, again, the destruction of God's people, and the destruction even of the sanctuary that had been rebuilt. And so God is foretelling that, and there's going to be desolation that will be decreed. In verse 27, he shall make a strong covenant with many for a week. So there's the king at that time is going to make a covenant, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifices and offerings. So now the worship's going to be somehow removed. And then it says, on the wings of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, as you look at this vision of 70 weeks and you see kind of how it ends, hopefully you understand that even though the details of the vision are kind of murky and I could go through them and take a little bit of time, what you see at the end is God's people being oppressed and not allowed to worship him, and then God coming in and destroying the one who's destroying his people. Just like we saw throughout the prophets. God always comes in, delivers his people, destroys the one who he might have sent to punish his people, the desolator, and that's exactly what he's foretelling in the 70 weeks, that he's going to destroy. He's still in control, even at the time that the people are going through great suffering. And that brings us to the final vision. In chapters 10 through 12, we get one vision that's pretty long, okay? And this vision is not easy for me to describe and lay out, and there's not enough time for me to do that. But what we see in this is Daniel upset at the beginning. He's mourning and he's fasting for 3 weeks. And it seems like he's probably been traumatized. I mean, this is a couple years after the last vision of the 70 weeks. He's probably just wondering, what does all this mean? Why are you showing this to me, God? And he's begging God to show him more, help him understand this. And God sends him an angel, and the angel says, I've been held up for 21 weeks because I was fighting with the prince of Persia, and we're just kind of, what is all that about? I don't know. But he comes in and he tells Daniel, he says, I have been sent to let you know what is going on and what all this is about. And so that's what he's going to do. In verse 2 of chapter 11, he starts. He says, and now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong enough, strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided in the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. As you start this out, I'm not going to go through all this, but as you start this out, what you see is the angel is telling Daniel what's about to happen in the future. There's going to be 3 more kings, and then there's going to be another king who's going to be richer than all of them, and he's going to stir up the Greeks. And then the Greeks are going to come, and they're going to have a really strong king, and he's going to destroy, but he's not going to leave the kingdom to his children. Alexander the Great died at 32, did not give the kingdom to his children. It ended up going to his generals, and they separated out all of the kingdom. And then it just starts laying out in greater detail. The king of the south is going to do this, the king of the north is going to do that, the king of the south is going to do this, the king of the north is going to do that, and then there's going to be a girl involved, and then this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and you kind of get lost. But if you go through history, you can see the Greek Empire being laid out and foretold before any of these events take place. There's the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And there's a number of Antiochuses leading up to Antiochus IV, and there's a number of Ptolemies that rule over these regions. And they battle right in between, and right in between these two nations is Jerusalem and Judah. And so as you get to the latter part of chapter 11, what you find is Antiochus being brought up. Now, he's not named, but he's brought up and he's talked about, and his work against the people of Jerusalem and Judah and all the evil that he does against them is laid out in detail, setting up an abomination in the temple. And you go back and learn the history of all this. It's really fascinating. And I'll briefly go through a little bit of it with you. But the point is, this man's going to wreak havoc on God's people. And as a result, people are going to be tested, and they're going to be refined. And those who know their God are going to stand firm and take action. And we have maybe some indication of the Maccabean revolt that's going to take place. But overall, he's going to exalt himself, and he's going to prosper. And one thing that you see throughout this is there's an end coming. And throughout this, he'll say there's an end coming, there's an end coming. And you just kind of wonder, when's that going to be? Is it going to be after Antiochus? But as you read through this, it becomes really kind of odd if you know your history, because it starts to transition into things that don't quite seem like things Antiochus did. It seems much more like things the Romans would do. And there's no clear transition, and this is from verse 36 all the way through the end of the chapter is probably some of the most debated texts in the Old Testament as far as what it's referring to. But it seems to be still referring to Antiochus and all of his evil, but it has direct application to the Roman Caesars who are ruling and doing the same kinds of evil as well. So I say it could be both. I mean, God is just giving a picture of what's going to happen during the Greek Empire, and the same thing is going to end up happening during the Roman Empire. In chapter 12, it says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as has never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered. Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." And it says Daniel then sees another kind of a vision of people, of men standing and angels standing, and they lift up, one of them lifts up both of his hands and swears that this will be for a time, times, and half a time, that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. And we're just left like, okay. And I'm sure Daniel was like, okay. And it even gives us the impression he doesn't really understand what's going to happen or how exactly this is all going to work out. How could you, right? If you're Daniel and you're in Persia, you're in Babylon, the Babylonian province, and you hear about the future and all these kings and all these things, you don't know what that really is. Like, you just asked for God to reveal something to you that you can't possibly understand. And now you come to terms with the fact, okay, I really can't understand this. But the point of it all is that God does understand this. And that God is going to save a group of people from the coming desolations. And He's going to deliver them. And He's going to establish a kingdom over all of these kingdoms. And He's going to purify for Himself a people who will be wise and who will shine like the brightness of the sky above. And that's an amazing picture of hope at the end of the vision, where Daniel before maybe had no hope or very little hope because he's probably focused so much on the desolations. So that's the book of Daniel. And to kind of help with your understanding of all these kingdoms and all this kind of crazy stuff I've been telling you, here's some pictures, right? We all love pictures. Here's the Babylonian Empire that started to take over and reign in Judah and Egypt. And you can see the Median Empire. To the east is Persia. And Persia mixed in with the Medians, overtook the Babylonian Empire. And all right. Then you have the Persian Empire. And you can see how big that is as it kind of zoomed out from that. And you see that this was a much larger empire that took over, but they picked on the Greeks, and then Alexander came in, and he dominated and conquered all of the Persian Empire. And eventually you can see how it starts to be split up a little bit with the Ptolemies, the Cassander, and the Lysimachus empires starting to formulate. And eventually you get to the Greek Empire being huge, just like the Persian Empire, with the Seleucids being the majority of it, and that's where Antiochus reigned, and then the Ptolemies being down in Egypt who battled against them. And then they're eventually in the Antigonid Empire, we get to the Romans. And the Romans start to take over, and they start to push in and become the Roman Empire. Okay? So that's just kind of a big picture, seeing the land and how it's being changed over time. That really kind of helped me. I hope that helps you as well. And here is a picture of all the different rulers throughout. If you were to go through and look at the history of the verses in chapter 11, all the events that are talked about actually took place in history. And it's led most people who are scholars to believe Daniel was written after all these events unfolded, because it's just too good. Right? I mean, he knows too much about the future for it to possibly be future. And if you want to look at this in greater detail, it's all available on the website. You can go on there and look at the slides and see this image. So, what is the message of this book? I think it's obvious, right? God is still in control. You're a foreigner. You're an exile living among wicked people who don't understand your God, who don't understand the truth about who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. And they're trying to entice you and pull you away from the ways of God. And what do you need to hear? God's in control. He is faithful to His people, even as they're in Babylonian captivity. And He's there with Daniel, and He's there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And He's right alongside them, watching and wanting to help them along the way so that they can glorify His name and bring His glory throughout all the earth. And God is the one who is setting up these kingdoms as we live in a world that has all this turmoil and all this strife and everything that's going on. How important is this message to us? He sets up kingdoms. He gives the freedoms and the limitations to freedoms and the slaveries and all those things as He sees fit. He sets up the lowliest of men, it says in chapter 4, verse 17. And He gives it to whoever He desires because He's in control. And then as we look at the apocalyptic language, we see He has a plan for His people and for a kingdom to be established. And that will be an eternal kingdom that will come during the Roman Empire. And does that sound familiar to us as Christians? It should, because Jesus is that Son of Man who became the king, who was lifted up on high, seated at the right hand of God, as we read in Daniel 7, 13 and 14. And he is given all rule and dominion and authority. And Revelation chapter 1, verse 5 portrays him as that. In fact, you go throughout Revelation, the picture of Jesus is he is the king, and he is the one who's over all the kingdoms of the earth, and he is in complete control. So Daniel is an extremely important book for us as Christians to grasp and understand in difficult days, that God is in control, and that we, as we live in an idolatrous and wicked society, I love this country, I love the freedoms and all the blessings of it, but it's wicked and it's idolatrous, and we need to realize that even though a ruler might say that they are a worshiper of God, there's still a lot of wickedness and rampant idolatry all over the place, all over the people around us, all over the media, all over our television screens. And we need to know how to live in that kind of society, how to remain faithful, and how to trust in God, even whenever it might be difficult. And that's what this book helps us with. And I hope that you'll take the time to study and read through and consider the things that are being said there as we deal with a lot of new circumstances and new laws that might come out and changes to the system, the government system that's over us. We need to constantly be remembering the kingdom that we're in and the expectations of our King, and remain faithful to Him even at great cost. And that's what we're here for. If you understand all of this and you've not submitted your life to Christ, you've not let Him be the ruler of your heart, let Him be the decision maker in your life as far as how you should live and what you should do, I hope you understand He is still in control. And that picture that we have at the end of Daniel, that some will wake up to eternal life and some will wake up to eternal shame. I hope you understand that those who do not submit and bow the knee before the Son will wake up to eternal shame. And I hope you're willing to make a change if that's you. Put your trust in God. He's in control, even if He doesn't seem like it. And He will deliver us in the end if we endure, if we're faithful. If there's anybody here tonight that needs to submit, will you please come as we stand and as we sing?